Hey, it's your old pal Lucid Stew again, and this time we're going to sculpt a basic face and head. Nothing super fancy or realistic, I just want to give you a general idea of how to do this. Faces are good practice when you're beginning in art because unlike some other things, it's difficult to not know when you're getting a face wrong. I'm going to start out picking a flesh tone color. You can do this fairly easily picking the lightest default brown, shifting the color toward red just a little and adjusting how dark you'd like it. There are some subtleties, but that will get you a decent skin color most of the time. I'll then stamp a default size sphere at the origin. You want to do this in your default orientation so your mirror tool works properly. Then I'll pull that edit out toward the rear one tick on a standard grid with the stretch tool. This is our cranium. Now we need a face. For the face, I'll use a sphere with blend, and I'll put that at the front of and slightly below the cranium. By the way, there are a million different ways to sculpt the face, and there are billions of different faces, so don't feel like you have to adhere to this step by step. With the blend turned up, you can see that looks like a somewhat familiar shape already. So next I'll add a nose so we have a better sense of how the face should be organized overall. We know that the nose goes from just above the eyes down to about halfway point of the face. I'm using a thin rounded cube for that. This gives us a nice straight structure without the unwanted baggage of a square, and I'll blend that just a little. That gives us a little blip of a nose, so let's adjust it with precise move. I'm going to rotate that up and drag it down. There are some basic artistic guidelines you can utilize to determine placement of the various parts of your face. Eyes are generally about halfway between the chin and the top of the head. The bottom of the nose is about halfway between the eyes and the chin, so 3/4 of the way down the face. Let's carve out some eye sockets so we have those present for reference. You can use spheres with some blend. I flatten this spheroid out a little to keep the brow and cheeks under control. There isn't a right way or wrong way, just varying results, and you need to practice to get a better feel of where your actions will take you. Just about anyone can draw or sculpt a face. That doesn't mean you can draw or sculpt the face you're intending, and that's the more difficult part. Even though I can make an okay face in 30 minutes or so, and I can make a tutorial about general art concepts, I'm still really not there myself on making what I want to make because I don't practice enough. When I get these negative spheres stamped, my result is somewhat weird and toony, but that's okay. One of the great joys in art is letting your mistakes take you somewhere. I'm using some more negative spheres with blend to thin out the underside of the cheeks here. By the way, if you hadn't noticed, I'm using mirror mode on everything since the nose. I'll use the same shape to bring the back of the cranium in toward the face. One major piece of advice I have with sculpting faces in dreams is to avoid edge shapes, at least until you feel competent with the tools. This is because edge shapes introduce straight lines into your sculpture that are impossible to get rid of completely, and faces basically don't have straight lines. I'm going to add a chin with more spheroids. If you look at faces in profile, generally the front of the face is pretty vertical except for the nose. That's a big chin and the eye sockets are way far up on the head, but it already looks like a face, so let's not panic and proceed with some cheeks. First of all, where I'm at right now is not realistic proportions, but that's okay. You can see that you can go off the rails, and as long as all the essential elements are there, you still end up with a face. For cartoony faces, you must not use realistic proportions, so it's good to get used to being loose and seeing where it goes. I usually make really long noses, so for this face I wanted to try to shorten the nose up and see how it worked out. I'm doing that with some negative flattened, rounded cubes with blend. The underside of the cheeks are quite gaunt, so let's fill those in with some blended spheres. The chin is too long and the forehead is too short, but other than that, this looks okay. I'm going to add an upper lip with the curve tool. Mouths are tricky, especially in dreams, because they have a fine edge where the lips meet the face. Also, lips don't generally look the way we think they do. Instead of the peanut with a line through it you might have drawn as a kid, the upper lip is generally quite thin and somewhat sharp. In contrast, relative to the upper lip, the lower lip is generally a fat blob. So that's not perfect, but it's okay. Almost looks like a mustache. It'll look more like lips when I get the lower lip in. For the lower lip, I'm going to use fairly flat half spheres. I know I said to watch it with edges, but I also said that lips have a hint of a line where they meet the rest of the face, so bear with me. Looks a little dumb, but it will improve with some adjustment, and the way things look will change as you change other parts of the face, and you can always come back later and change it, so don't get too hung up on things that don't look perfect. Below your lip, there's an indented area before your chin comes back to project to the rest of the front of the face, so let's carve that out with a filled donut. But the lower lip is also supported from directly underneath, so we'll rebuild that with some blended spheres. And remember what I just said about looks changing as other parts change? Well, that did it, so I'm going to adjust the lower lip. Now I'm going to square off the jaw. We're going to have a nice manly jaw, so I'll use rounded cubes and really go bold. So there are two things about jaws that you need to consider. One is general. The back of the jaw ends at the ear, and the ear is about halfway from the front of the face to the back of the head. The second is dream specific. If you want to use this for a puppet, which you probably do, you can't add any of the neck stuff that would make this look more natural. You just have to be satisfied with the necklace head. One tricky part about faces is that there's sort of a face within a face. The middle part of your face from your eyes down to your chin is relatively flat except for your nose, and then your cheeks and jaw kind of wrap around that from the sides of your face. But that only holds water if we're talking about expressionless faces, otherwise the face gets contorted and wavy in various places. So flattening out the cheek in the middle of the face just a bit with some flattened spheres. I tend to make very broad noses, which is fine if you're going for a certain look, and some people do have very broad noses, but I want to try something different, so I'll thin this nose out with some more negative flattened spheres. The transition to the lower nose is usually somewhat abrupt, so I will attempt to recreate that with filled donut. Nostrils are a little tricky. You can use curve tool, but I think a very simple and effective solution is half sphere. I don't get too hung up on the holes. You won't notice them at lower sculpture detail anyway. If you're sculpting a bust that's 50% graphics thermo, then you'll approach this differently. It's not perfect at every angle, but this is starting to come together now. As noted previously, the forehead is way too small, so let's give it a boost with some blended spheres. I'm going to pull that pretty far forward to get it in line with the rest of the front of the face. And we lose most of our eye sockets, but that's okay. We still have a general impression of where the eyes will go. And that right there was a huge improvement simply by getting one portion from a massive extreme to close to what you might expect in reality. So keep that in mind. I'm going to add some brow ridges with blended filled donut just to accentuate the difference between the forehead and the eye sockets. Most people don't really have these, especially women, so keep it subtle unless you're going for a much toonier look. In general, this will be a more masculine trait, but our face already has a bold jaw, so let's go for it. Now we want to create a jawline out of the chunk of rounded cube we laid down earlier. I'll use a very flat filled donut with a lot of blend. Remember, we're going for the back of the jaw being about in line with the midpoint between the front of the face and the back of the head because that's about where the ears should be. I'm going really bold with the jawline and squaring it off even more with some large blended filled donuts. In hindsight, I actually like the first face better without this change, but that's art. At the same time, it's not necessarily bad. Now we have the face of someone older and overweight, so you have to look at the product of your choices as variations on what's possible. If your face just doesn't look human anymore, that's one thing, but there is no standard face, and there are many different types of faces and mixes of proportions. However, this gentleman is not what I'm going for, so let's trim the fat, so to speak. I know what I said earlier about avoiding edge shapes, but we want a fairly even cut. I will have blend turned way up, and I'm going to make this cube large enough that the edge impressions don't affect what we've put down so far. So you can do it, but you want to be careful. This is looking like that Minecraft meme guy, so I will soften the sharpness of the jaw with some blended negative spheres. The lower part of the cranium is looking a little high, so I will add some blended spheres. I just want to point out I'm not using reference here. All of these different proportions and how one thing looks too big or small are impressions I get because I have studied the subject of faces and heads and art. And by no means am I the greatest sculptor, but just realize you'll probably need to put a little time in to get better at this sort of thing. And now the cranium is a bit long, and most people have a sort of flat angled portion on the top part of the back of their heads, so I'll use some blended negative filled donuts to accomplish that. Also, the head is just a hair wide, and usually the skull comes in a bit near the temples, so more negative blended filled donuts for that. Going back to the eye sockets we previously filled in with our forehead edits and excavating those with some slightly flattened, blended negative spheroids. And the objective there is to make room for the eyes, but also retain the cheek and brow ridge detail we've already built. I'm going to make some very simple ears with a thin filled donut. Ears are quite complex. I don't want to get that crazy with this tutorial, but there is a basic rule that is good to know. As we've discussed already, ears go about midway between the front of the face and the back of the head. The front of the ears should line up with the back of the jaw. Ears are much larger than you imagine them in your mind's eye. A very common art mistake is to make the ears tiny. Ears are enormous compared to how we think of them. The general proportion rule is that the ears extend from the top of the eyes to the bottom of the nose. If you don't believe it, check in the mirror. This is a general rule. Some people have big ears, some people have small ears. So let the idea be more of a guide than anything else. Also, you don't want to pin your ears against the side of the head. Ears generally extend out pretty far. So for these ears, I've put down a pretty big filled donut. Then I've copied that and dragged it down diagonally into the head. For the earlobe, I'll use a smaller, slightly fatter filled donut. One tip on ears specifically is to make sure to check the view from the front of the face often, because what you think you're doing from the side is often very different from the front. And then go through and adjust with those two views in mind until you have something you like from both angles. Ears done, let's do some eyes. Eyes are probably better done with a separate sculpt, but we'll say this is a less detailed piece that doesn't have a concern for animation or close-ups. Eyeballs are essentially spheres and they rest in the eye socket. They do not take up the entire eye socket, so keep that in mind. Also, eyes have a lot of variations, so as long as you get them generally correct, you should be fine. The supporting flesh and eyelids fill in the rest of the socket around the eyes. This is the most important part of eyes. They do not sit on the surface of a face. They are in your face, and they are partially covered by flesh. If you keep that in mind, the rest is fairly easily accomplished with filled donut. You want to keep blend off, because you don't want to blend the eyeball. Do that for the top and bottom eyelids. The top will take more work, but same concept. You can also use the curve tool for this. I will add some simple irises with a flat spheroid. I find that using a shape works a little better than spray paint. I would apply those roughly and then adjust with precise move afterward, as it's difficult to get it right on the first try anyway. Then I'll spray paint the pupil with surface snap on using a cylinder shape. There isn't much point getting more intricate than that at the surface detail level we're working at. And that's pretty well done. The nose is flat, more than my personal taste, so I'll mess around with getting it pointier using some smaller blended spheres, but this is as complete as a face and head sculpt needs to be for a character. And let's see it on a puppet. So in this video I showed you how to sculpt a face in Dreams for PS4. There are of course many ways to sculpt the face, and many faces to sculpt. Hopefully you've at least taken away some concepts of proportion, and the idea that these concepts will come easier with practice. Some people are very talented and can pick up these things right away. For the rest of us, it will take work, so don't be discouraged when your first few attempts aren't all that pleasing. Definitely don't give up after one failure. It's my experience that an immediate second attempt immediately shows improvement, and you need that positive reinforcement when learning. Plenty more videos to come, so stay tuned, but that's all for now. Until next time, I'll see you in the Dreamiverse.